Hi, hello everyone. Can everyone hear okay? Beautiful full house. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you, Tommy, for being with us today to talk about your book, There, and hopefully to talk a bit about the book that you're currently writing, which is very exciting. I did want to take a moment and acknowledge the land that we're on of the Cahuilla people, who have been stewards of this land for time immemorial. So thanks for having us here to talk about this book. I guess the best place to kind of to start would be land. There's a very beautiful line in your book, There, that says, maybe I should read it properly, the land is everywhere or it is nowhere. That being Indian was never about returning to the land. Sorry to start right in the middle, but I figured why not?
Yeah, so that partly has to do with acknowledging, that everywhere in the country is, where this country's original people lived for, thousands and thousands of years. But it's also that whole prologue. What it's aiming at doing is trying to have the reader think about urban spaces as part of the land too. I think as humans we feel that we either have been given everything by God and we hold dominion if it's a Christian idea, or we're sort of like separate from everything. And as I say in the prologue, like the materials that make buildings and freeways and glass and wires and rubber, it all is derived from the earth. And we often treat it as it's like this other thing and not part of the land. Like it's processed and it's like not as natural and beautiful as a mountain, river, or whatever. But I was trying to, because it's about urban native people. I was trying to get the reader to think about how a people would relate to this artificial environment as they would the land. And often the way we think about real native people and authenticating them, they have to be with the land, and probably they have to be historical, is the way we often think. And I was trying to write a very contemporary book that has to do with people thinking about what it means to grow up in the city of Oakland.
I guess that's a good place to actually ask you about yourself and your background, because you're from Oakland, and I'd love to hear a bit more about you, where you come from.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Oakland. If you know Oakland, it was the nearest district is the Diamond District, and it's not like where people sell a lot of jewelry. There's a guy, Hugh Diamond. It's Dimond that it's named after. And I went to Oakland Public Schools, and then I was not really a good student. I wasn't a reader. I grew up playing roller hockey, actually. That was my first love. Like the first thing I was really passionate about. This was the 90s. I was born in 1982. So that the heyday of rollerblading and roller hockey was the 90s. And there was a professional sports team in Oakland called the Oakland Skates, and we would go watch them play where the Warriors used to play. Sadly, we lost that team to San Francisco. And I was pretty good at roller hockey, and because there was a professional team and sport, and I got sponsored by a company when I was 16, and I traveled, for years I traveled around the country playing this sport. It seemed feasible that I could do this, and then everyone realized rollerblading looks horrible, and the roller hockey died as a sport. Live on ESPN in Huntington Beach, the end of the sport happened, as it was getting on ESPN. Everyone was wearing super bright uniforms and short shorts and neon pads, and there was a ramp behind the net. It became a spectacle, and then the sport actually died. There's no longer a professional sport.
Wow. You were the last generation. It was a history in the making, actually.
Yeah, so I wasn't a reader. That was what I was into. And then I got into music kind of in my 20s, and I got a Bachelor's of Science in the Sound Arts. So I was a sound engineer and I made music, and realized after I graduated that there was no viable job for me. And I got a job at a used bookstore, and I fell in love with reading for the first time, like when I was like 24, 25.
I love that story. I love that you came to reading after a lot of practice in your body. And we were talking about this a little bit in the green room. And also through music. By the way, did you play an instrument?
Yeah, I still play guitar and piano.
Did you ever play for anyone or just like for yourself?
There was a period of time where I would play like open mic. I was living in Taos, New Mexico for a little while, and I would play piano just to like get over the nerves of it, which I never did. I was always terrified, and I'd forget everything as soon as I was playing in front of people. So it's really more of something that I like to do on my own, and I compose music, but it's not something that I enjoy doing in front of people.
Well, I think it's just, as we were talking about a little backstage, like it's such an interesting way to come to writing. One, having been an athlete, a professional athlete, and having this like very deep embodied practice, which is like about getting knowledge through your body, right? As opposed to what one might think of as like the intellectual pursuit of writing. I guess I'm curious about that connection or where you find that connection. I know you run still, so maybe you could talk to that a bit.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like creativity, starting with music, like as a doorway to creativity, and even before that, with sports are an expression and involve creativity too. So having both of those things happen before anything intellectual was happening. I mean, I wasn't not thinking, but I wasn't interested in intellectual pursuits in any way. I think it did something. It continues to do something to my process, where running is like a part of my daily writing practice, and I think I can come up with solutions to problems in the writing, like some of the bigger and more complicated problems. I can come up with the solutions when I'm not at the screen, not at the keyboard, because the thinking that I'm doing, I'm accessing some other part. So a lot of the structural stuff, like I have a lot of voices in the novel, and people are always like, how do you organize all of the voices and structure it? And it really, a lot of the work happens when I'm running and when I don't think that I'm thinking. The thing will pop, something will pop into my head, and I'll understand something about the organization in a way that if I hit my head against the wall and sitting at the computer for hours, I can't come up with it that way. So I think something about creativity and allowing the thing to come that I learned in sports and in music, it's not the same thing as inspiration. It's putting something into practice and allowing the space for something to come. Like learning that early on, I think it formed how the discipline that I have now with writing.
So how is the discipline that you have with writing, actually?
I mean, it's different, year by year. I first started writing there right after becoming a father for the first time, and I was working, a pretty demanding job. I worked at the Native American Health Center in Oakland, and in the behavioral health department. We were like starting up a media lab and storytelling center, and so I would just write before, I would wake up at 5 or 6 a.m. and write before work, and then I would read parts of the novel as it came out to my wife on our back porch, like after the baby went to sleep, and that was like the first 2 years of writing it. Part of that time I was in an MFA, so I had a very structured and like feedback heavy system because the MFA requires that. And then I was traveling a bunch because I was a digital storytelling facilitator. That was like my side job. I was sort of finishing the book and doing that. So I had hotel rooms and airplanes. And then once the book came out, the same thing. And now I have a 5-month-old. We just had a new baby, and that throws everything into back to like 5 a.m. writing again.
Well, I'd love to talk too about, you mentioned the kind of the multiple characters and the nature of a polyphonic novel, right? Like writing from all of these different perspectives. I'm curious about the connection to music, like thinking about polyphonic music and all these voices. But also, this is a two-part question, thinking about like where do you find yourself in the characters, or do you?
So I think, I don't think I was thinking musically in constructing a book full of voices. Like I don't listen to opera. I mean, I kind of do, but I, I can't say like I'm an opera listener or whatever. I've never been to the opera. I liked other books that did it, and I really Native people are a communal people, and Western thinking is very individualistic. So I think it worked really well too to express a community voice and explore people who have been flattened and stereotyped and really just have lost humanity and nuance. So to give them all these different ages and different experiences sort of was to resist the way we've been flattened. In terms of the characters and which one of them resembles me the most, we were speaking earlier about Dean Oxendine. So he is a filmmaker and he's putting together a storytelling project about people from Oakland who are Native, and that's essentially what the structure of the book is. But I did the exact same thing Dean did. I mean, that's where it came from. I went in front of a cultural arts grant panel for the city of Oakland, and they gave me $5,000. It was like the most money I ever got. They gave it to me over a 2-year period, and I did not give them a storytelling project. It was the book, and I apologized to the woman who was cutting my checks, and she ended up being a fan of the book, and I got to meet the mayor, and I just recently got a key to the city of Oakland, and when I was in front of everyone getting the key, I apologized again for misappropriating the funds.
Oh my gosh. Well, also congrats on your key to the city.
Thank you.
It's pretty major. Also, like this book, has everyone here read the book, by the way? Everyone has, right? It's major. Like your first novel, New York Times bestseller, Pulitzer Prize finalist. It's like a big deal.
It's been a lot. I mean,
That's
it's
it.
almost
That's the tweet. That's all I got.
it's almost 5 years since it's been out, and it's been a lot. Was not a public speaker at all before the book came out, in any capacity, and avoided it as much as I could. And then I was doing like a 30-city book tour, and was doing public speaking every night, and then the tour never stopped. This is still the tour. And I was a mess for a part of it. It was really stressful, and but I took my wife and son on the tour. We got to go to Europe. The book's been translated into like 30 languages. And eventually I stopped sweating as much and feeling sick as much. And it became okay, but it took a while to figure out that having a book, which is something you do in private for people to experience privately, to be becoming this really public thing, to like be the face of the book and the voice of the book, was not something that I ever anticipated. And had I known it meant that, I probably would have tried to avoid success.
Okay, well, you're doing a really good job. No one can see you sweating. I'm definitely more nervous. I guess it would be really interesting to hear a bit more too. I mean, the book takes place, like we've talked about, across 12 different characters, and they all converge at a powwow. Have you been to a powwow?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up going to powwows. The first one we went to, I think I was like 17. My dad took us to this Berkeley gymnasium. It was like a super small powwow. And we went, and I didn't even realize why he was taking us. We went because, so we grew up not in the Native community in Oakland, community for us meant driving 3 days back to Oklahoma, where my dad grew up, and that was family. It was a small town. Hammond, Oklahoma, is where he grew up. So we didn't really know that there was a Native community in Oakland growing up. I didn't know that till I worked in it for like 10 years later on. There was one other Native family that we would see all the time, and those were the Browns. And it was kind of confusing to me because we're the oranges and they're the Browns, and I was like, are we all just organized by color?
Oh my God.
But the reason I was at this powwow at the Berkeley Gymnasium is because Paul Brown, the kid that was my age, was dancing. And it was the first time I'd seen, I think it was the first time that I really looked at it. I'd probably seen it and just sort of knew that's, but it was probably peripheral. But having this kid that I grew up with, seeing him, and since I'd seen him last, it was probably a few years, and he'd gained a little bit of weight, but it was the lightest feet I'd ever seen. He was, it was like he was flying. And it was also, it just felt so contemporary and ancient, or just really old. And for those two things to be happening on this gymnasium floor, he's like hopping over, the free throw line on a basketball gym. And, I just loved it. And then I worked as part of a powwow committee when I worked at the Native American Health Center, sort of understood, how the thing gets put together, and understood that it's essentially a dance contest, and people come away with money. And this was part of the seed for the idea. So the book, is like a heist sort of plot in a way. And I came up with it because I knew all powwows, and I knew the bigger powwows have a ton of cash on hand or gift cards. And because I'm like naturally criminally minded, I'm like if there's that much cash and no security, if the wrong person knew, and that's the premise for the book. That's where it came from, is because I worked on this powwow committee.
Because you actually wanted to stage the heist.
Because I think of ways to get away with things even if I don't act on them.
Right. Amazing. It's beautiful to hear that story about your friend Paul Brown dancing, because there's a great line too in the book about dancing like the singing birds, right? Like to be light like the birds are singing. It's like a really gorgeous way to think about dance, coming from a dance background. And I love that too, this way when you speak about traditional or ancient versus contemporary, well, not verse, but rather layered on top of each other. There's great passages about, I'm blanking on the character's name, but like looking at the internet, right? And like looking at these YouTube videos to figure out traditional dance, and learning through how culture can change currently in a contemporary world. Like through the digital commons, as opposed to what other kind of commons we might share in past generations.
Yeah, and I didn't experience the internet the way somebody like Orville, who I write about, I sort of came upon the internet, when I was like 18. I got an email address because I went to this college of digital arts in 2003. But in imagining a character that did grow up with the internet, it's like a thinking tool. Like kids go to Google search immediately as a way to think with the internet. And so I was trying to imagine a kid whose caretaker, in this case his grandmother or like his great auntie, if she was not giving him the cultural information that he was curious about where he comes from, why would he not go to the internet? And it can be a really rich source of cultural information. It's one of the many things it can be. So I imagined that, what that would be like, and that's where the idea of where that came from. But it was also had to do with my dad growing up being sort of reticent about our past because of pain, and not wanting to transmit the pain with the information. So there's a lot of silence. And I wondered at that through the character Opal. Like, why would she not pass this on? Everyone thinks it's like automatic, like of course you pass it on, but it's complicated. And sometimes when the pain is, so intertwined with the history, some people they choose to not speak. And so the internet sort of fills that space in the book.
Yeah, and it's also beautiful too. You speak about, the urban Indian experience and how, it's people from all over the country who might be moving into cities. So people from different tribes or different peoples, different backgrounds, and suddenly there's an intertribal or an interethnic kind of creation of new culture.
Yeah, and that's, the makeup of cities is so intertribal. The name of like one of the main community centers in Oakland is the Intertribal Friendship House. And the powwows are super intertribal. Like if you go to around the country, if you go to powwows that are on reservations, mostly it's that tribe's powwow. But in the cities, people came from, starting in the 50s and 60s, came from everywhere and went to cities everywhere for work or, plethora of reasons. And they started families. And, if you have two people from two different tribes marrying and then their kids, maybe they marry somebody who's native, maybe they don't. Maybe they marry somebody who's also two tribes. In youth circles, because I worked with Native youth in Oakland, when you're introducing yourself, you would hear somebody name like 4 different tribes. And that's a very different identity than somebody who grows up around their people, maybe knows their language or is familiar with it, and knows they belong to the one tribe. It's a very different identity. And it's fraught with insecurities too. Like if you don't quite belong to the one thing. And I really wanted to explore that because I saw it so much, and I felt it too growing up that way.
Right. Can you speak to your personal identity, actually? Like,
Yeah,
if we were
so,
in the youth group, what you would say?
well, one of the things that you say if you're enrolled, usually you say you're enrolled because we, in the Native community, we have a problem with people sort of identifying when they shouldn't, or to advance themselves in academia, putting something on their resume. There's like a real problem. And so you say, like, I'm enrolled with this tribe because that means like I'm official. I'm not just saying that I am. But I'm half white, and I sort of have existed in a city like Oakland. It's like it's easy to be ambiguous because a lot of people are mixed. And so I was so familiar with that sort of identity, belonging to not belonging place, being from Oakland, and the Oakland Native youth were too, to some extent, but to exist in the wider Native community, WIDER, is a different thing, because of how many things it is fraught with around authentication and faking. It's just it's really rich to write about, and that's part of why I wanted to write about it in a novel, because the novels can really contain a lot of those complexities.
So, do you think it's tied, the wanting to write about it, with the birth of your son? Like, how did that coincide?
So I thought of the idea for the novel like 30 days after finding out I was going to be a father. So they're totally like, related to one another. Before writing There, I was from like 2005 to 2012. I was writing like really experimental stuff, short stories, like really unreadable stuff that I was just trying to find my voice. And having a son and becoming a father, it made me want to take on something more serious. And so it was completely related to starting the book. Had to do with like the responsibility of, I have to teach a human how to be human. What kind of human am I? What am I doing? What do I love? What am I taking seriously? And I'd been trying to take writing seriously for a while before that, but that really just like, was the final push.
Feels related somehow to what you said about your father having a lot of silence around things because it was too painful, like wanting to not have silence around things for your son.
Yeah, I think, you start to think about what you're going to tell these people when you know you're going to have them. And yeah, not wanting there to be a big silence and really wanting to have a much more open relationship with him. And some of that is like figuring out what do I think. And part of what I like about writing is that it's an extension of thinking. It's like refined thinking because as you contemplate your sentences and you move to perfect them or make them clearer, you're clarifying your own thinking about things.
I guess since we know you're working on a second novel, it would be nice to hear about how you're clarifying your thinking around that and what it's going to be called and what it's about.
So I came up with the title first. And it is a lyric from a 90s alternative rock band again. Although the Radiohead song, I think, is early 2000s. There from Hail to the Thief. I think it's 2001 or 2003. So it's from a Portishead lyric, Wandering Stars. But it's actually, she got it from, Beth Gibbons got it from the Bible is where it first appears in the book of Jude, which is the one right before Revelations. So I've never been good at memorizing Bible verses, so I'm not going to tell you here, but if you go look it up, it's a really weird, as many Bible verses are. And there's something just in the title that made me want to write into it. And a lot of what I initially wrote into in 2018, before There came out, is nowhere to be found in the book now. But that's the writing process. It's supposed to come out next January. I was in Sweden as part of the book tour. I was being given a sort of a meta tour of a museum, and I say meta because museum people now know how problematic their work is in like stealing people's stuff or like having people's stuff and not knowing what to do with it. So the guy was like giving me this tour, like, yeah, we have these people's stuff and we know it's wrong, but we're still trying to figure out what to do. And here's some of your people's stuff, and it was like Southern Cheyenne stuff. And while I was there, I saw a newspaper clipping, and it said Southern Cheyennes in Florida in 1875. And my tribe was never in Florida, never near Florida. And I was like, what were we doing in there in a newspaper? And it was like this before and after picture of like, they had sort of their traditional clothes and then they had military uniforms, the before and after. So I fell down this rabbit hole. I was writing mostly about the aftermath of what happens in There as what I was writing into. And I realized that Southern Cheyennes have this very specific piece of history. We were at this prison castle where Richard Henry Pratt was the jailer, and he came up with the idea for boarding schools based on 3 years with these prisoners, half of which were Southern Cheyennes. So I realized we were this really like crucial part of history, a really awful part of history, but Southern Cheyennes don't appear that much in history, and so I wanted to write about it. And what the book has turned into is kind of a prequel and a sequel in one. So it could be read as like book 1 and book 3, and there's sort of book 2. And I could see them putting it together like that in the future. The book split up into 2 sections that I call Before and Aftermath. And it's based on, those before and after pictures, both at the prison castle, but then he used this as kind of a marketing technique in his campaign to kill the Indian, save the man. So he would take pictures of the kids when they got there, then they cut the hair, put them in military uniforms, and then sort of advertise that as like, this is how we save the Indian problem, or solve the Indian problem.
So your people, the Southern Cheyenne, would have been taken to this prison castle in Florida and put in prison, or what was this like? What was this?
So they got put on a train at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and they got taken all the way to Florida. They stopped in Indiana at one point to show them off. There were like 10,000 people showed up to see them. This was sort of the era where, you know, they were being called the vanishing race. And the idea that they could see, you know, the race as it was going was like a draw. And people, when they were at the prison castle, people would come from, you know, thousands of miles around to come see them. And they would, this was actually in some ways one of the first Indian art colleges, because the prisoners would sell their artwork. They were given these ledger books, like, that actually are meant for, you know, keeping track of sales. They were drawing in the ledger books, and they would sell the drawings to people who came. They would polish sea beans. They would make bows and arrows. They were performing Indianness sort of for the first time as a, you know, as a way to make money, and they would get part of the profit. So that was like 3 years of Pratt testing out his idea, like, if we just militarize them, they can be as good as white people, which he learned because he was in charge of the Buffalo Soldiers. So they're named, these are black soldiers who were named by Native people because they thought their hair looked like buffalo tuft.
My mind is blown. I've never heard this.
And Pratt learned by being with these black soldiers, oh, they're just as good as us. Like, you know, there's a lot of thinking about there being a hierarchy of, you know, better humans, right, and white people being up here. So he sort of started learning that with the Buffalo Soldiers, and he was like, well, let me militarize them and see if they can be as good. And he became really convinced that, you know, the way forward was just to integrate them into society. And the boarding schools was supposed to be sort of a, you know, a gesture on the way there. He ultimately wanted Native people to be in public schools, and he wanted to abolish boarding schools. For his time, he was, you know, even though he gets painted as a really awful person for coming up with the boarding schools, because they did horrible things to kids over decades' time. That was not part of what he came up with, and I'm not saying he was a great person. I write from his perspective, and in the next book. But for his time, he was one of our best advocates as far as those types of people go. He was the first person to use the term racist in a publication in 1904. Racism.
Racism. Mm-hmm. Wow. So he was the idea of integrating, the idea of assimilating would have been radical and progressive at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, off the reservation comes from Native people legally were not allowed to leave.
Right. So, well, I mean, obviously there's a lot coming out, in the last few years, there's been a lot coming out about the boarding schools and the finding of these horrible, like, unmarked mass graves. Are you going to speak to the boarding school, like, terrors? Obviously, it's, like, a very traumatic part of Native American history, so.
I don't really go into it that much. I really wanted to write about this prison castle because it's my tribe's history. In the book, the son of one of the prisoners does go through Carlisle, and that's Pratt's school. But it's really about how this family ends up in Oakland. So I glance over it. You hear about it. I reference it. You're in it a little bit. But I was not trying to write a boarding school novel. A lot of people with more personal ties to it have done that. It's been written about extensively. So I just, that's not something that I felt like, that's not what I wanted to write into.
And did you visit this prison castle in your research, or?
I would have, but the pandemic sort of had me Googling and like looking
Internet.
At pictures,
Digital comments
online. Yeah, it would have been great. St. Augustine is supposed to be a very weird place, and I still hope to go, but I think the thing will already be written about.
Okay, well, I would just say one last thing, that you said something about how the title of the book came to you. and that you wrote into that. I'm kind of curious, do you ever think about the way information comes to you? Like, I've been working with a lot of artists who like almost channel. They like get a jolt of like new information, and then it comes through them so that we can educate others. Do you think anything about that?
No, I don't think, I don't, it doesn't really happen. Like, they're there, the concept for they're there came like that. It came like as a singular seed of an idea, like, oh, have them come to the powwow. Bad shit's gonna happen. And like, as a way to explore these people from Oakland and have their lives converge in finding out how it's all related. Like, that came as in a moment. But, Wandering Stars wasn't like that at all. The second book has been excruciating as a process. I think with their success, going through a pandemic, and writing is just really hard. And success didn't do anything to help me in confidence or, like not having the same doubt at the page. But that's also what makes you a good revisionist, and most of writing is revision. You have to have the doubt. If I just went out and like with supreme self-confidence, I'd write a terrible book. So it should be hard. I just hope the next one's not as hard as this one was.
Well, congratulations on being at the almost finish line on it, and hopefully
Thank you.
it's going well now in the last edits. Looking forward to reading it when it comes out in January,
Yep.
right?
I hope
Ish,
so. Yeah.
ish. So
My
everybody be on the
editor
lookout.
said if I get the edits in mid-February, we'll be good for January 2024.
Okay.
And I have a good friend of mine who's a poet named Kava Akbar, who I we wrote our novels together. It's his debut novel. He has that coming out in January. So we both started, sort of writing at the same time, writing our novels together and trading pages. So it's kind of cool that it just happened to be, and he has my same editor at Knopf, and that's all coincidence. I really want it to be January 2024,
Got
just
it.
to have that happen.
Yeah, you have to give birth to the book at the same time.
Yeah.
You've been through it together. I think it would maybe be a good time to open to questions. If
Sure.
you're open, if people have questions, we'd love to take some. Yes.
Tell us how you got from studying music, from that career to working with the kids in the Indian community.
Well,
It sounds like that was the kickoff for your own evolution as a writer.
I would never call it a career in music. I went to school for sound engineering, and the school's just trying to make money like so many art colleges. Like sort of like selling you on the dream that you're going to become something. So I got a job at a used bookstore after that non-career thing. And at the same time, that was a part-time job at the same time. So roller hockey actually led me to the Native community in Oakland. So these brothers from Philadelphia who are Indian, from India, but they grew up in Philly. They were my coaches and like sort of surrogate fathers in a way. Their cousin worked at the Native American Health Center. Again, India. But he happened to work, as a data manager, and he brought me in initially just as a data entry person. So I was working part-time at the bookstore and then working at this community center, and just sort of worked my way in over this period of about 8 years to eventually, I was, doing a lot more community stuff and work with youth at that point. And it was very formative for the book. So that was how I pivoted, I guess.
So it's serendipitous. It's not like it was some particular path that you were searching for.
Totally serendipitous. Yeah, the roller hockey to Native community connection is bizarre.
There was another. Yes.
Given the huge success of the book and the fascinating characters, has there been interest in a screenwriting adaptation? Because I think it would be great, particularly in a longer series.
Yeah, so I sold the TV rights pretty fast after the book sold. I think before the book came out. I sold it to HBO, and they had it for 2 years, and Sterling Harjo was adapting it. He is the creator of Reservation Dogs, which is a great show you all should watch if you haven't. And then they dropped it. And then somebody else bought it, and they paid a lot more for it, and it allowed us to move back to Oakland, which I'd moved away from. I was living where my wife grew up in the country. And now I'm sort of crossing my fingers but not holding my breath about whether it'll actually be made.
Yes, please.
What were a couple of the books that made in the used bookstore that made you fall in love with books and reading? Do you remember?
Novels-wise, Confederacy of Dunces and Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar. Now, I had never finished a novel my whole life. So I was like, wait, what is a novel? And I read this thing that was like so funny and sad at the same time, and that a piece of art could contain those two things. I was like, yes, this is what I've been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. Not so much Bell Jar is not funny. But, that they both also killed themselves, I think, drew me to some kind of urgency that people were writing from. I think there was something really grave and serious that I was drawn to, their story, the actual stories of the authors. But I was also reading a ton of religious books and sort of like in search of meaning in my 20s. I was reading psychology and philosophy. I was reading Plato and the Upanishads. Like I was just like really searching at that time. And Kafka and Borges really got me early on. Just like this writing can do what?
Yeah.
So yeah, it was all over the place. And I read a ton of works in translation, probably before I got to a lot of American authors besides those two. I read a ton in translation, but I was completely self-driven. Nobody was telling me what to read. I was really just being paid to read in a used bookstore that was slowly dying, and it did die.
Yes, please.
So much is made now of whether you have a person has the right to tell a certain story, and it sounds like your background was not so much steeped in native culture and experience because your father didn't talk about it much. So did you feel the burden when you started to write the book of wondering how authentic it would be?
Well, my dad's a fluent speaker in Cheyenne, and we grew up, hearing him speak Cheyenne to us, and we would go back to see family, and he didn't say nothing. He wasn't a mute. But what I wrote into and what I leaned into was a kind of insecurity itself. So I wasn't trying to write some authentic native voice that I didn't have. I was writing from these characters who have complicated histories. So I never felt like I was doing something that was out of my range. And I think range has everything to do with whether or not you can write it. I think it can be really clumsy when people step out of their vocal range. And I think it's a lot of times people either lack imagination or experience when they're writing outside of it. But I always felt like I was writing, right in my zone of experience.
We probably have time for one more. I think you had a question. Yeah.
A few months ago, now that COVID is kind of waning, I went over to Fantasy Springs to a powwow. And it was because of your book that I was able to experience in the depth that is possible. Just the visual nature of the costumes and what everyone wore, and the oral nature of the different drumming groups and all of their sections. But most importantly, I was waiting for something really bad to happen. And also the whole marathon nature of the day as it went on, and it's been going on for several days. So I really thank you for that, because I don't think I could have experienced it in a way as I did, because I'd already read your book.
Thank you.
That's really beautiful. I guess
Oh,
sorry.
she recently went to a powwow after the pandemic. waned, and really got an in-depth experience, even though she was feeling impending doom the whole time because of the book. But got to experience like the beauty and the the regalia and the marathon nature of the thing.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you, Zoe.
For being a joy to talk to.